Everyone. Welcome to our last lecture for World History to 1500. This lecture is kind of a combined lecture from week 12 and 13. I've decided to cut down the course by one lecture to give you a bit more time to work on your papers and kind of lower the load in the last week, what we call dead week oftentimes, so that you can focus on your final exams or your final papers, and just to wrap up a little bit quicker. So today I'll be talking about the Renaissance, Oceanic explorers and colonialism a little bit less, and also modernity. Maybe I should have put modernity in the title of this lecture, because at the core of this lecture, now that we are closing up the course, ending the pre-modern history of the world here, we have to ask the question, what does it all mean? What does it mean to be modern versus pre-modern? What is that distinction? And a big point in today's lecture is that we don't have a universally agreed on definition of modernity or non-modernity, pre-modernity, and that it is kind of an academic construct, an ideological construct, or a social construct to say that we are modern people today, that I am modern and you are modern, we live in a modern world, or perhaps a post-modern world. I'll talk about that maybe just a little bit. But all throughout this course, we've been looking at a part of human history, the bulk of human history, which it is pretty widely accepted can be called not modern, pre-modern, or non-modern. And today, we're kind of dovetailing with the next course in this series. If you go on to take world history from 1500 to present, you are theoretically looking at the modern world, or at least the change from pre-modern to modern and then the modern world. Some people will say the modern world starts in the 17th or 18th century. Some people say it starts around 1500. Some people say it's even a little bit later or earlier than those two times. And I've made similar arguments this term about, perhaps Song Dynasty China was the first modern society, in which case we'd be going back to the 13th century. But today, what we're going to be doing is looking at the rise, quote unquote, of Europe from my perspective as an Asianist. So the non-European focused historians look at the rise of Europe, early concepts of modernity. The idea of being modern has been around for quite some time, and maybe has shifted a little bit. So we'll look at early concepts of modernity. And also a little bit at oceanic exploration and trade and early colonialism, although really those last two kind of straddle the pre-modern and the modern course, and especially colonialism belongs more in the modern course than in the pre-modern course, as does really extensive amounts of trade. One argument you could make, in fact, is that the expansion of trade across the globe, especially long-distance trade, and the connection of places together that comes with extensive amounts of trade is a sign of modernity. Some people argue that. So for today, the textbook readings are from chapter 17 and 18, about 10 pages each. You don't need to read those before today's lecture, because today's lecture is not directly connected to those, but you could read it before or after today's lecture. And I want to start with Petrarch and what might be a kind of standard start to a Renaissance lecture. So the standard, completely out of the textbook Renaissance lecture might start with someone like Petrarch or another great thinker or great artist, and talk about them and how they are a symbol of the Renaissance and what the Renaissance is, right? So I'm going to do that, but then I'm also going to kind of break that down in the next couple of slides. So Petrarch lives from 1304 to 1374, and he is often cited as being the world's first humanist, meaning someone who is mostly interested in the acts and qualities of mankind, as opposed to the acts and qualities of deities, gods, or God. And so Petrarch is famous for humanism as this sign of him as the first modern man. And this isn't a philosophy course, I'm not going to go super in depth into this, but his look at humanism is essentially saying that our focus as intellectuals, our focus as human beings, should be on improving ourselves, improving what we can do as people, as individuals, improving our learning, our education, our ability to do great works and do great things, and focus less on pleasing the gods or getting into heaven, and that will all happen on its own. You know, if you are a good person, if you do good things, if you work to improve yourself, you are already working within the desires of the God in the heavens, or the gods in the heavens. And Petrarch is not atheistic, so to say, but he is kind of rejecting the idea that everything you do to improve needs to be through the church. So that's a major part of his humanism. But the question I have, I guess, is he the first person to come up with this idea? And maybe he is in the exact terms that he is talking about. Of course he is. But if you look at something like Chong Buddhism from China or Zen Buddhism from Japan, they're kind of the same tradition. It's kind of a humanistic practice. You are meant to consider the world around you and consider yourself and look to improve yourself, and to find the way to improve your humanity from within, rather than from the blessings of the Buddha or anyone else above you. And so in that way, Zen is a very humanistic practice that had already been around for multiple hundreds of years before Petrarch. So it is, in my opinion, a bit Eurocentric to say that this is a new movement, this humanist movement. It's new to Europe, perhaps, but not to the world. And that's been something I've harped on throughout this course, I guess, is that there are places on Earth where people have already figured some things out ahead of time before so-called modern people show up. But let's go ahead and keep going here. What is the Renaissance, right? And I could click a link here. I can go to history.com. I don't really love history.com, but I could read you a very basic definition of the Renaissance. In fact, I will. Let's go ahead and read their first paragraph of what the Renaissance is. So history.com says, the Renaissance was a fervent period of European cultural, artistic, political, and economic rebirth following the Middle Ages, generally described as taking place from the 14th century to the 17th century. So starting right around the time of Petrarch through the 17th century, the Renaissance promoted the rediscovery of classical philosophy, and this is a big part of Petrarch. Petrarch had gone back and looked at old classic philosophical texts from Greece and other places, and literature and art. So the Renaissance is a period of literature, art, and philosophy. Some of the greatest thinkers, authors, statesmen, scientists, and artists in human history thrived during this era, while global exploration opened up new lands and cultures to European commerce. So travel and trade are a big part of the definition here, right? The Renaissance is credited with bridging the gap between the Middle Ages and modern-day civilization. So then I would start with a question for you, which is, do you think people living in the Renaissance felt like they were living in the Renaissance? And unfortunately, I can't wait for your answer, right? But my answer would be that probably most of them did not see a significant change between the quote-unquote Middle Ages or quote-unquote Dark Ages and the Renaissance, and that the Renaissance as we know it today and as we look back on it historically is largely a phenomenon that affected or impacted kind of like the 1%. The very wealthy, the very educated people at the highest echelons of society were the ones who were really experiencing this quote-unquote rebirth of philosophy, art, and literature. But most people didn't experience it. And in fact, the definition of the Renaissance, as with many historical definitions, is something that we apply retroactively to kind of compartmentalize this time in this place on Earth. And so this narrative of from darkness to light is a bit difficult to swallow if you're not thinking about the upper echelon of society, or if you're thinking about the way people experienced history as they lived it. So while I'm not necessarily saying it's 100% wrong, it is at least a little bit off for the bulk of the people who lived in this time. We do see interesting, I would be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about Renaissance art, so I'm going to for just a moment here. We see interesting developments in art, very realistic depictions of human beings. You may be familiar with the idea of secret messages in some of these pieces of art, and Michelangelo may have been kind of a humanist himself, kind of like Petrarch, because people often argue that, for example, this painting of David and God, or Adam and God, I believe it is, touching each other. I'm sorry, I'm not a Western historian, but touching each other is representative of the human brain, that God here is sitting within the human brain, and that it is the human mind that is kind of responsible for some of the divine creations, quote unquote, that humans see everywhere. So Michelangelo may have been himself a bit of a humanist, and I thought this was one way to describe that. And there's a link here to some of that writing. We also, around the time of the late Renaissance, now we're past the period of this course, in the 17th and 18th into the 19th century, start to see a lot of talk and a lot of ideas about modernity or civilization. Not always spoken in terms of modernity, but we see people talking about civilized versus uncivilized peoples around the world. And this is used to justify a lot of the darker acts of colonialism, the trading and slavery of human beings, and the exploitation often of other people outside of some of these European countries. And this is a big reason why we see a lot of a division into civilized and uncivilized, and later into modern and pre-modern periods. That's one of the purposes it serves. I wonder if there are other purposes it serves. There are much more benign ones, of course. And maybe you could talk about this a little bit this week in your discussion board posts, our very last one. But I wonder if there are other reasons you can think of, or if you could expand on the reason I just gave as to why we divide history into modern and pre-modern, or indeed why we create other divisions, including civilized and uncivilized, or early modern, perhaps, post-modern. Early modern history, depending on the place on Earth, is often this period from maybe 1500 through the Industrial Revolution, or maybe through the 19th century. And postmodern is the period we theoretically live in now, according to some at least, wherein modernism has peaked and we are now past this period of quote-unquote progress. And so this interesting flyer from the Department of Sociology at the University of London called After Progress is certainly making an argument that modernity is now over and we are postmodern, we are post-progress. And this is an interesting little map here from Japan. I'm not sure exactly when it is from, but you can click here to learn a bit about this research project on travel and encounter in early modern East Asia, early modern, quote unquote. And this map from Japan is probably from sometime in the either 18th or 19th century. I'm not exactly sure, but that's about what it looks like to me, depicting the people of the world and the people from outside of the Japan-China sphere. So here we have the continents, theoretically. So the question that runs throughout this class is, what is modernity? And how do we, or through this lecture, I mean, so what is modernity? How do we categorize and recognize change in people, places, and ideas? Because fundamentally, modernity is an argument that there has been a change from one thing, pre-modern, to another thing, to modern. Are all those big changes something that is always written about? Are there other ways to see them? Yes, of course. So as I've stressed throughout this course, we can look at objects, right? In this case, we could look at architecture as a sign of quote-unquote modernity. And who imposes these changes? That's another question you can think about. Here I have 3 hotels. Hotels are an interesting example because they are often built to cater to people from other places, right? So here we have a hotel in Saigon, in Vietnam, a hotel in Shanghai in China, and a hotel in Calcutta, each of which is fairly Western looking, I guess you could say, right? They look like something that you would see in Paris or London from around, the mid 19th century to early 20th century. And they're very Western, right? Um, and they were probably, when they were built, and I know this to be true at least about the Peace Hotel in Shanghai, built mostly to cater to Western visitors to these places, visiting these colonies, and these were all colonies at these times. Although Shanghai wasn't really a colony, but it's close, right? But they're built to appeal to Westerners, and they're also built to seem very modern. And they would stick out kind of like a sore thumb from some of the other buildings around them at the time they were built. They would look quite different. And so, as symbols of progress from pre-modern to modern, or from uncivilized to civilized, and this is not, I'm not saying that they are, but this is what people would maybe argue for in constructing them this way. We see a lot of the change through material. And I think architecture is a very interesting one. Looking at how architecture changes over time, and I know this is much further down the road here in the 19th and 20th century, but it still shows you the perception of what it means to be modern, to be civilized. Here's an example from Japan that we can think about when we think about identity and how much of our identity comes from tradition. I'm not going to get too deep into this, but if you know much about World War II in the Pacific, there are often a lot of things that happen in the Pacific theater from the Japanese in terms of wartime atrocities or the way they fought the war, including things like suicide bombings, kamikaze attacks, and also their treatment of others in battle or in prison, that is blamed on pre-modern Japanese history. And you can imagine that pre-modernists like me and like Carl Friday, who wrote this, have a big problem with that. You can't just blame all of your horrific acts from World War II on the way you were 400 years ago, on some long-standing Bushido tradition. But it is regularly the case that people make this argument. And Americans would make this argument when they were fighting them. They'd say there's the samurai tradition living in these Japanese soldiers, and it's part of why they're so fierce and why they fight the way they do, why they refuse to be captured, etc. And the Japanese also bought into this. They were told that they were possessing the soul of the samurai when they went out to fight in World War II. And Friday argues that modern, I'm going to read this here, that modern ideas about Bushido and the samurai tradition were out of sync even with those of the early modern bureaucrats who first tried to enunciate a code of conduct for the samurai. And that politicians and others who condemn the samurai tradition, who blame the legacy of Japan's warrior past for the atrocities and other wartime misbehavior committed by the Imperial Army, are distorting history. And the real big argument that he makes in this article is that real samurai were nothing like people in World War II. And yet, there is this sense of identity which persists today in Japan that you see between modern Japanese people or present-day Japanese people. I have to be careful with the word modern during this lecture, and the people of hundreds of years ago. So some of our social and cultural problems are linked to tradition, but tradition is probably not solely to blame, right? I give you the loaded question here. And this is the case for places all over the world. You could talk about modern America and some of the issues we have with the mistreatment of certain peoples based on their race, their sexual orientation, their religion. You can often hear arguments about those things, and I don't subscribe to these arguments, I want to make that clear, that, that's just the way it is. That's just the history of our country, this dark part of our traditions, and that it's very difficult to change because of that, or impossible to change because of that. And I'm saying to you, no, you cannot blame tradition. Blame all of your modern present day problems on tradition or on a pre-modern legacy, that in fact you have to deal with those issues more directly and kind of own them yourself. I hope this is not an offensive take on this, but that's kind of been an issue in Japan, and you do see it in the rest of the world with all kinds of dark parts of our history, of colonialism, of slavery, etc., exploitation, that should not be blamed solely on tradition, as it's kind of a scapegoat. It's kind of an easy way out to not take any responsibility for the way the world is today. We do start to see a new idea developing around really a little bit before the 1500s, but it's really becoming more prominent from the 1500s onward, of an Eastern and a Western world, that they're almost separate worlds, right? They're almost two different planets, which are connected, but so different that they do not mesh with each other all that well. And so ideas of East and West have existed for a long time, and they are sort of a symptom of this shift to modernity, that some of these cultural differences are things that are now front and center and readily apparent. Here we have a map from 1796, kind of an interesting map. And it's interesting for a few reasons. It is not entirely inaccurate. It is not the most accurate map of all time, that's to be sure. For example, the shape of Australia, or the shape of much of island Southeast Asia, or Japan, the shape of China, which is a bit smaller than it should be, the shape of kind of a lot of these further away countries is distorted and looks different. The Arabian Peninsula, for example, quite distorted. And also the names of some of these places. So we have New Holland. We have the kind of symptoms of colonialism becoming apparent in at least some of these places. Hindustan for India. Western and Eastern Tartary. So the world is still in flux, as it is today. It's highly in flux, and it's not yet fully understood. Even in 1796, it's not yet really ironed out. And this means that even after the Renaissance, or even very late past the end of the Renaissance, humanity is still continuing to interconnect, really for the first time in some cases, across vast distances. And we start to see the role of imperialism across Asia and across Africa and the Americas, shaping the world in new and, very significant ways to history, often in negative ways as we perceive them today. And a lot of this is done, why? In the name of progress, in the name of modernizing these places, integrating them into the economy of great, powerful nations in Europe, quote unquote, great nations in Europe. And so the excuse for a lot of colonialism and imperialism is that we are modern and they are not, or we are civilized and they are not, meaning similar things. And so it's important to point out that the idea even of the East versus the West is a part of that phenomenon. An interesting book I want to point out here called The Great Divergence. I don't agree with everything that Kenneth Pomeranz writes in this book, but this is an interesting argument that you see talked about quite a bit, which is that there is a great divergence between China, which may have been one of the most advanced countries on Earth, or places on Earth, I shouldn't say country, places on Earth, and Europe, which was sort of behind it until the advent of mostly of coal and also of seaborne trade on a really high level, and that the exploitation of the Americas by Europe was one factor. As Europe began to rise economically over the rest of the world, and coal was really the other. The development of the steam engine and fire burn from coal England happens to have a ton of coal deposits in it. It was one of the richest places in the world for finding coal, and it was not far away from major centers in England. And so this leads to the Industrial Revolution, which is entirely a subject for the modern half of this series of courses. But this Great Divergence is an interesting book if you wanted to look at it for maybe one of your for your paper here, if it fits your topic, that talks about the shift from a world that did not have a superpower really to a world that started to have something like a superpower in the colonizing forces of Europe, or a set of superpowers. So then my question is it East versus West, or West versus everything else? And by West, at this point, in the 15th to late 15th to early 17th century, we're really talking about Western Europe beginning to explore and also claim vast stretches of land around the world. This map is a great one for this. And we start to see these voyages from Europe to Africa and the Americas form this circular trade network, or triangular trade network, which you may be familiar with. I believe they teach it in high school quite a lot. While in Asia, early contact was limited largely. You can see most of this doesn't make it to Asia. Largely kind of confined to missionaries and the occasional trader and explorers. So it is no longer the Silk Road that is handling the bulk of the world's economy. It is now this Atlantic Oceanic triangle or circle of trade. This is a big shift. The Silk Road is still active, it's still being used, it's still traveled on, but there is way more trade, exploration, and movement happening across the Atlantic than we ever see from Asia to Europe until the modern, postmodern world. Today, we've gone back to the case of the Pacific probably being the largest network of trade between China and the US, etc. Often, arrivals to Asia were unwelcome surprises, although this varied. For example, missionaries coming to Japan, we'll talk about them in a minute, were rejected most of the time. Marco Polo, who I didn't really talk about much in this course, but he's a historically problematic figure. The extent or degree to which his stories are true is not something we really know. But he wasn't the first European in Asia, but he's the first documented example. Some of his stories probably not firsthand, but we do start to see Europeans showing up in Asia, although much less than across the Atlantic. From 1497 to 1499, Vasco da Gama of Portugal reaches India by sea. This opens up a lot of trade. This was obviously a part of what Christopher Columbus was trying to do, and what other explorers were trying to do, is find a route to India. And Vasco da Gama was actually the one who was successful in doing this. So I'm giving him credit here, not Columbus, because Columbus was effectively a failure, just lucked into finding a land of plenty, essentially. And in 1511, Afonso de Albuquerque, I'm sorry if I'm butchering the names here, leads the conquest of Malacca, which is used as a strategic passage in this area. If you're traveling through Southeast Asia, you're going to go through the Straits of Malacca, which is the strategic passage through Southeast Asia to China. So around 1500, these explorations have found most of the world. Not everything, there's still a little bit more to do, but by 1500 to 1550, the world is beginning to be largely figured out. You can see Hudson is one exception here, but most of the world is kind of roughly figured out. And that represents the end of this course, this figuring out of the rest of the world. A wave of missionary travel followed in the 16th century after the initial explorations. Like with Buddhism, they bring with them knowledge of Western science and technology. In Japan, we see depictions of black ships, or kurobune, these black iron ships with steam towers and paddle wheels, completely unthinkable. And as their intentions became clear, missionaries were tolerated in China and Korea. This is part of why Korea has a large Christian population today. And for example, Japan does not. They were banished from Japan. We have famous movies about this, like Silence, which I actually have not seen. I probably should see it, but I have not seen it. But Japan remains famously much more insular, especially compared to other countries in Asia, until its forced opening in 1853 to 1854, and the failure of the Tokugawa regime and pretty much the end of the samurai in 1868. So what about history and identity? Let's talk about Friday's argument one more time. This argument is from an article called Bushido or Bull. I probably should have put these slides together, but anyway. The argument that he's really putting together there is that your identity, while it is a mix of the place you come from and the traditions you ascribe to, a lot of your identity is a consequence of the world you actually live in. Not necessarily the long distant past, and that although traditions are important and a significant part of our lives and our history, they should not be used as scapegoats for escaping the realities of who we are and the things we are doing in our lives or as a society, as a polity, as a country. That you can't just blame tradition, you have to kind of own it. And I kind of already made this point. But yeah, it's an interesting juxtaposition. Here we see, a samurai as we would know them, the great Toshiro Mifune, one of the best samurai actors of all time, kind of representing the modern image of the samurai as we know them. It's a sword-wielding guy kind of fighting on his own, this spirit of, never giving up and always, always fighting till your last breath, is adopted by a lot of business people in Japan. The salaryman being the new modern samurai. The guy in his suit who goes off to work and stays at work for 16 hours a day. This is something that was really big in the 80s and 90s. It's starting to die off now, but there's still this image of the salaryman as fighting to his last breath, just like the samurai did, even though they're not doing any of the same things. They're going to work in an office. They're getting on a train in the morning. So Japanese business culture, for example, often draws from samurai tradition, theoretically, quote unquote, it's not actually samurai tradition, to explain these kind of horrible practices of not getting to see your family, not getting to go home until it's dark out, and leaving before it's light out, and kind of working yourself to the bone. And this is a more benign example of how tradition can be kind of misused to cause human suffering in the present day, and one I thought would be interesting to point out. Yeah, this slide is out of order too. These two slides should have been in different places. But anyway, this is an example of the island in Japan that was built in the 1600s. It's an artificial island that was constructed to house foreigners as they visited Kyushu. And there was a Dutch man who ended up living there. The only people the Japanese allowed to live and trade with them for quite a while were the Dutch, because they were the only traders who came without any missionary intentions. So after they had kicked out the Portuguese, the Spanish, and others, I don't remember every single country that came to Japan in this time. This is actually after the time I study in Japanese history. But especially the Portuguese were kicked out and killed for trying to bring a new religion to Japan, which was seen as a direct threat to the emperor, who is technically resting at the top of the Shinto belief system. And so Engelbert Kampfer is an interesting accident of history in that Dutch people were allowed to live here on this island called Dejima, and he got to see all kinds of very interesting things because he was not part of a missionary corps. So if you're interested in this, you can get a book called Kampfer's Japan if you want to read about that some more. Some food for thought as we start to wrap up here, because I know I'm kind of rambling a little bit here. But there are many definitions of modernity. I want to present to you a really quick one here from 1986 in the, very high-level, important historical journal called Past and Present. It's one of the big journals here we have in the U.S. for people to write their academic articles and have them published in. And this is just a quick research note by someone called Mark Elvin, who's a pretty well-known historian. And if you want to go read it, it's only 4 pages long, but he's talking here about a definition of modernity. So even in 1986, and I promise still today, historians cannot agree on what it means to be modern or pre-modern or postmodern. And this is one person's attempt to kind of put a tag on everything. So I'll go ahead and read this to you. Reading a recent essay by Kolakowski called Modernity on Endless Trial alerted me to the realization that Europocentric historians still seem to find the concept of modernity elusive. For a historian whose work focuses on an area outside of Europe, in my case mainly China, and I identify this as someone who does Japan, the term can be given a fairly clear and definite sense, even if, like most historians' terms, it is hazy at the edges. It would be interesting to know how this non-European perception appears to colleagues who possess a much more refined knowledge of European history than I do. The practical advantages of the definition offered below are one, that it is not based on chronology and so escapes the confusion caused by continuous updating, or in other words, the pressures to treat what is more recent as thereby more modern, and two, that it enables one to see societies as varying combinations of modern and non-modern elements, sometimes mutually supportive, sometimes mutually indifferent, and sometimes mutually hostile. In this view, of course, neither present-day Western Europe nor present-day North America emerges as wholly modern. So if you want the actual full definition, you have to read all 4 pages. But you get the idea here, especially from the number 1 and 2 that Mark Elvin provides here, that his argument is that modernity is kind of a condition that is not universal, that is not even constant, that you could fall in or out of or arrive to and leave. And so this is the argument that I've been talking about a couple times this term, that a place like Song China was probably modern, even though some of the dynasties that followed the Song dynasty might not have been modern, or that parts of them may have been modern while others were not. And it also gives this interesting argument that, there is a Europocentric issue that we have with defining modernity. Because if you define modernity based on essentially the colonizing forces of history, you end up automatically discrediting the colonized peoples of history, or the people who were not part of these colonizing forces. And I see a lot of logic to this. I agree, at least in part, with the arguments made here. It is a bit of an old argument now, at nearing 35 years old, but at the same time, I think it's very useful. And you can click this link here if you want to go read it. You should have access to it through the school, through LaGuardia, if you can find the working definition of modernity. So it's a complex concept, right? When did we become modern? When were we not modern? And I think something for the discussion board for this week that you might try doing, that maybe the discussion leaders might try doing, is that in your head, you could try to make a list of the things that people, places, countries, and ideas that makes them modern. And I have a list for you on the next slide that maybe you can talk about. So you don't have to actually sit down and make a list, but you could talk about this one that I'm going to show you. And you could share your list, perhaps, if it's a little different with the class. And I like this image. There's not much I'm going to say about it, but here we have the steamroller and the elephant. So we have a Western invention pushing the elephant, which is the Indian community, towards modernity, at least through technology. And this is from the British Raj, which was a newspaper / magazine from the 19th to 20th century that ran for about 100 years. And I just really like this picture a lot because it demonstrates a lot of the things I'm talking about in this lecture today about perceptions of civilization and enlightenment and Western modernity. So what does it mean to be modern? Here we have one table created by someone called Jenks. I'm sorry I don't have the link here, but that is describing the pre-modern, modern, and postmodern periods. So first off, it actually puts dates on things, which a lot of people are not brave enough to do. So from 1000 BC to 1450, this Jenks person, I believe he's a sociologist. I'm not sure, actually. He may be an anthropologist. Puts that as pre-modern, modern as 1450 to 1960, and then since 1960, we've been postmodern. He puts different elements into his definitions, like production, society, time, orientation, and culture. And I'm not going to read all of this, but this kind of list is very brave to put together because it's very easy to pick apart, right? Pre-modern period is slow changing and reversible, for example. If we look at time here, it's so easy to pick that apart, right? The pre-modern period is not slow changing, especially if you count it as running through 1450. There are some really rapid periods of change happening in the pre-modern world. Just to point out a few of them, you could see the Mongols, for example, a 100-year-long dynasty that changes the world forever and probably in more substantial ways than almost anything else except for maybe the Industrial Revolution. It really repaves Asia and Europe. You could say, for example, the fall of Rome, which, yeah, it's slow in some ways. It takes a few hundred years, but the rapid recession of Roman influence, for example, from certain parts of the world, from Northern Europe, from Africa, is a pretty quick radical change. And I could sit here listing these out. I'm sure you can think of some too. But to say that the pre-modern world was slow changing is definitely false, in my opinion. Furthermore, to say that the modern world has been entirely linear is also, I don't know if this is supposed to be specific to Europe, in which case you might be able to make some arguments here, but what about World War I and World War II, which are certainly not signs of progress in at least every way. But it's pretty easy to argue against the idea that the modern world is purely linear. And then postmodern is fast changing and cyclical. I don't know, since 1960, has the world always been fast changing? Has it always been cyclical? I await the period of the recycling of the 1960s, but I don't think it's going to happen, at least not anytime soon. So these lists are interesting and something you could debate and discuss pretty easily. Or perhaps you could take the argument that we have here from Bruno Latour that we have never been modern, that modernity is a pure invention of the historian or the academic or the person trying to explain the world in some other way, and that the idea that there is such a thing as modern and pre-modern is in and of itself a betrayal of reality. So you could read this book. It was originally written in French, but has been translated to something like 100 languages or something, including English, if you're interested in the take of an anthropologist / sociologist on what modernity really means to, humankind. And I think it's really an interesting argument. So I'm going to go ahead and leave us there with this idea of what is modernity. You'll have to take the next course in this series to get a better answer for that, more of an answer for that, as this course is really here to set you up for understanding what modernity is, not to define modernity for you. It's here for other reasons too, but if we're talking about modernity, this course is mostly a setup. Next time, there is no next time. We don't have another lecture, but we do have your week to work on your papers, which are due on the 9th. The 9th is, let me look up really quickly here. The 9th is a Tuesday. You can get it to me by midnight on the 9th. It's fine. I'll be grading them starting on the 10th. And unfortunately, late papers cannot be accepted because I have something like 48 to 72 hours to grade all 60 of your papers and work out your course grades after that due date. So if you miss that due date, your paper will not count. Be sure you get it in on time, okay? Even if you're not quite happy with it, even if it's not 100% perfect, turn in something to me by the end of the day on the 9th so that I have something to grade, okay? Additionally, if you haven't finished either a short response or the object analysis paper, I want those in by Sunday. That's the end of the month, this month, the 31st. Also at midnight, please get those into me so that I can use that time between the 31st and the 9th to grade all of those things, okay? As some of you know, I am moving out of the country at the end of this term. I'm moving to South Korea, so I really will not be available after the end of this term. So you need to get everything in on time and make sure you get all of the work complete. Even if you're feeling like it's difficult or you're running out of time, get me something and it will be much better for your grade than turning in nothing at all, because there are still a few of you who have not turned in an object paper. You need to get that done now. Okay, let me know if you have questions. Be sure to watch the videos about the source analysis paper and about research and writing again in this course. I believe those are from week 4 and week 11, although I uploaded the one for the source analysis paper early. Make sure you watch those. They should answer most of your questions. I'll be on email all week next week. And thank you very much for taking part in this course. I had a lot of fun putting these lectures together. I'm sorry that we couldn't do it face-to-face. I think that would have been maybe a more enjoyable experience. We get to bounce ideas off each other and have more discussion. But hopefully it was still productive for you, and hopefully the formatting still worked out. Feel free to let me know in your course evaluations things I could have done better. I wish we could have avoided this crisis and gotten around it, but feel free to give me ideas for the future, because I will probably teach remotely again. And if you have any kind of thoughts, maybe from some of your other classes, the things I could work on, I'd be happy to hear them. And I really do read your comments, and I keep them in my teaching portfolio so that I can look at them in the future and share them when I'm applying for jobs. Your teachers do that. Your professors do that. So they really do count. So thank you for putting in those evaluations. All right, I'll be seeing you on email and on the discussion board this week. And I hope you all have a good end of your term and a good summer. Okay, thanks very much, everyone. I'll see you later.